And it's a pleasure now to introduce Anne-Marie Kimball, who is Professor Emerita of Epidemiology and Medicine at the University of Washington. Now, she's the Senior Program Officer for Epidemiology and Surveillance Global Health in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And she's leading cross-cutting surveillance strategy formation process for vaccine development for the foundation. And her position focuses surveillance and early intervention and country ownership of the same. She's going to talk on strategic thinking about global disease surveillance, a wicked problem. Thank you very much for coming. We look forward to your talk.
Well, thank you very much. It's a little intimidating to speak about something related to complexity with Professor Arthur in the room, but I trust that he'll be indulgent of me. I'm a practitioner. I'm really not a philosopher. Although I was a professor, I used to refer to myself as an accidental academic. Prior to that, I was largely programmatically involved in WHO, in state government, in federal government. So what I'm trying to do with this talk is really meld the theory with the practice in looking at a wicked problem, and in fact asking the question, is global infectious disease surveillance a wicked problem? And if it is, what does that tell us about how to solve it? So we have many challenges in global disease surveillance. I'm going to spend a little time talking about how we do global disease surveillance because that's our early warning system for pandemics. However, it's not actually. To tell you the honest truth, after 40 years in the field, the biggest strength of an early warning system is human relationships and people picking up the phone and talking with one another based on their social relationships about something unusual happening. However, the backdrop to this is our quantified disease surveillance systems, which we rely on when those human relationships aren't there, and we need to use numbers to inform us of something changing. But our system in infectious diseases is fairly broken worldwide, and these are some of the problems that you see on the left, on the right with that system, and I'll go into it a little bit more. What we're trying to do really is to sort of track infectious disease syndromically in population groups, across borders, to get an early warning when something unusual is happening or something is changing in the ecology of population infection. And the problems that we're running into are the systems that we created are far too often vertical. They don't talk to one another. We have a very uneven infrastructure in the very poorest countries, which Eric has outlined for you as the most dangerous for infection. Ironically, those countries have the very least capable information systems to detect what's going wrong within their populations for their own governments and for other governments and for other populations to understand and prepare. So this is a diagram we put together a couple of years ago in the foundation to sort of look at what we call the broken landscape. This is how global infectious disease systems work currently. Unfortunately, I don't have a pointer, so you're going to have to just follow me with your eyes from the bottom, which is basically the source of information that goes into infectious disease surveillance. So we have providers, we have other sources of information going up the information aggregation chain, and then at the top, you see the users of information. I hope the print is large enough for you to understand the basic message of this slide, which is that our systems are siloed between government systems, disease-specific systems, pharmaceutical studies of populations, which can give you a great deal of surveillance information. They're all segmented, they don't talk to one another, and for the user group at the top, which includes national governments, international organizations, as well as others, modelers, et cetera, one has to really bring a diversity of information together. So this is basically, you don't need to read every single red dot on this slide, but if you plot very systematically where the delinkage is occurring, you see that it's really all over the global system in this schematic. And that's really the only message to take away from this slide. So the question of whether this problem is a wicked problem, I find very fascinating. How many of you are familiar with the concept of wicked problems? There we go. 3 people. Wicked people, no, not wicked people, wicked problems. Back in 1973, there was a paper produced by Riddle and his associates, Riddle and Weber, on what is a wicked problem. And the thing that I find interesting about the concept of the wicked problem is that it takes into account not only technical complexity, but social complexity, and the centrifugal forces that that creates. That means to say pulling away from the center of any potential solution. It's really a fascinating concept. And so in reading about this and becoming a student of this, I became more and more convinced that this actually applied to global health generally, and in particular, it applied to the infectious disease surveillance space. I started by reading Conklin, who did a very good abstract of the previous work in 1973, but he only included 6 different aspects of a wicked problem. And in fact, there are 10. So I'm going to warn you that sometimes over 20 years things evolve in the way that they're transmitted in the academic community. So what he said was, you can't fully understand the problem without developing a solution. Problems and solution have no stopping rule. Solutions are not right or wrong. Every wicked problem is essentially unique. Solutions are one-stop operations, and problems have no given alternative solutions. So I was curious. I mean, this all made sense to me because each of these applies to surveillance, as we'll talk a little bit about. But I was curious what he left out. And when you go back to the original, there were 3 other aspects, at least, of wicked problems from the original riddle, which would have stopped me in my tracks, frankly, had I started on this wicked problem of surveillance, because the most frightening points, in fact, were taken out. Every wicked problem can be symptomatic of another problem. So not only do you have the problem in front of you, but you have the myriad of problems behind it. That wasn't transmitted in this abstract. The existence of a discrepancy representing a wicked problem can be explained in numerous ways. So you have a very tangled solution space. Not only do you not have one solution, you have a whole bunch of different solutions. So it's really, really intriguing and very complicated. The planner has no right to be wrong. This is what would have stopped me as the planner. And why? Because they say problem solvers dealing with a wicked issue are held liable for the consequences of any actions they take. This is really frightening when you're in an organization. Because those actors will have such a large impact and be hard to justify if they're not correct. So really, in the distillation of the wicked problem construct by Conklin, a few important points were left out. Be that as it may, let's continue to talk about the application of the wicked problem construct to strategy formation. So for the last 18 months, I've been leading a strategy formation process at the foundation to look at infectious disease surveillance. Our foundation is a complex organization of about 1,000 people, and I should emphasize here that I am not speaking for the foundation. I'm speaking for myself as a small practitioner within that larger group. But we've been struggling with a very siloed organization, recently reorganized to try and emphasize working across our different disease-specific silos. So we had 12 program strategy teams involved in this. So the question is, how do you take this wicked problem construct and apply it to the strategy formation process per se? And in fact, that's been done before. This is a further distillation of the wicked problem construct that was brought forward in looking at how you do strategy formation, so it even gets a little bit more truncated. And later, I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'll tell you about the technical solution space just a little bit, which is very, very sophisticated. And then we'll talk about the social space. But this is the construct as it was applied to two case studies involving Walmart and PPG Incorporated by a business practitioner, and I'll describe that more fully as we go on. But as you see, it was a further distillation of the wicked problem construct. So we have really elegant technical solutions. We have unprecedented communications. In fact, there's every reason for those stacks of information to be talking to one another currently in this space. There's really no excuse in terms of the technical capability of communications. We have a lot of tools for automation, so information should be faster than ever, and in fact, it can be. Our laboratory sophistication is increasing. And we're able to track pathogens very specifically across national borders, and that's, of course, key for pandemic control. So I want to just show one particular example, which is one of many. If you look at the polio literature, you'll see the same elegance of molecular tracking going on. Anytime you have a serious eradication effort or a serious epidemic effort with an unknown solution, you'll find these kinds of very sophisticated technical molecular solutions coming to the fore, and that's really our ambition for how we see the technical space around surveillance. And so this is HIV, one of the 5 diseases that Eric mentioned, and one of those that in one of my previous responsibilities, I was the head of national program support for the Pan American Health Organization for Latin America and the Caribbean, and I can attest to the fact that shock, awe, and bewilderment were exactly what we had in the late 1980s, especially before we had any antiretroviral treatment for this illness, which was universally fatal. So this is really some elegant work that comes from Tebbutt in the Lancet Infectious Diseases, and I'm using it here as an exemplar of how you can use molecular epidemiology to really track the different clades of HIV. And I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail and try and explain which of the sugars and which of the proteins distinguishes these various clades from one another. You'll just have to trust me that there are 4 major groups, M, N, O, and P, and based on looking at their molecular fingerprints, one is able to track 2 different things. First, the first incursion into a population, which is called a founder event, and secondly, the recombinant events that result in new clades or new types of clades. But basically what it gives you is a map. And this is a map that shows you the origin of some of the first clades from the chimpanzees in the Congo area, and also shows you the global transmission that occurs. So if you're thinking about pandemic diseases, you need to think multisectorally, as we've heard. So beginning to think about what's this travel pattern that's causing this? Are there any materials that are causing this? I doubt very highly it's related to cell phones, Eric. But, but certainly there is a lot of transmission and a lot of intercontinental travel-related transmission going on with HIV. And in fact, if you dig way down into this, you'll also find out one of the less well-known transmission patterns was in the factor VIII manufacturing for hemophilia in the mid-1980s, where we couldn't screen until 1985 for HIV, and yet we had a very active trade in blood fractionated products from the United States into the Far East. And that's been well cataloged, especially in the Canadian literature, less so in the American. So what does a wicked problem construct help us with if our ambition is really to bring that very elegant molecular epidemiology and signature into a global look to understand the transmission of pathogens? What does it really help us? What's the how that we get from a wicked problem solution? Well, if you go back to this work of John Camillus that I referred to, where he looked at strategy formation per se, which is a different activity than just running an organization or trying to problem solve. This is where you're really trying to create a plan for your way forward for the next 5 to 10 years. In our case, it will be 5. He brought forward some lessons from both Walmart and the PPG case studies, which I found very relevant to what we were trying to do in the foundation. First, you need to involve stakeholders, which is basically also what David Nabarro was talking about. You need to involve the people who have the most skin in the game, document their opinions, and communicate. You need to define your corporate entity. What are your values, competencies, and aspirations? And this all, this is really practical stuff, at least for a person like me. This was these are the steps you need to be sure you're thinking about as you move into the strategic formation process across a foundation and dealing with our many partners. Focus on action using the Pareto technique. That's to say, take an action which is most likely to be successful based on a historical landscape analysis. That's called the Pareto technique. I won't go into details on how that business technique is used, but it's very useful if you're trying to figure out the best way forward. And then feed forward as you take action. So really, you're in a virtuous cycle of acting, moving, and then saying, this is what happens when we tried this. This is what happens when we tried this. You're not standing back and saying, I'm going to have 100% certainty on where I'm going with my boat. You can't. So you have to just start navigating, and then you change course based on what works or what doesn't. So it's a very iterative process, and indeed that was the process we followed. I want to talk about social complexity and surveillance, and this will go back to something that Eric will recognize. This is the Asia Pacific Emerging Infections Research Network, which is out of Bangkok. And this is some mapping we did with one of the organizations we fund called CORDS, which is Coordinating Organizations for Regional Disease Surveillance. It's a consortium of 6 informal disease surveillance networks all over the world, and these networks are based on trust, individual trust. Probably the most well-known of these is the Mekong Basin Disease Surveillance Network, which you probably noticed a logo on one of Eric's slides. But this is just the networks that relate to this one small research network. This is the proliferation of relationships in their universe that they have to consider as they move forward with activities. These are their stakeholders. I mean, it's mind-boggling when you look at it. This is also seen at country level, and recently there was a report out from the high-level interagency UN group on what we call indicators. So in developing countries where you have the very weakest systems in terms of government, quantitative sciences, systems of transmission of data, you're having increasing demand by donors for indicators of success and accountability. So you've gone from 44 indicators in sub-Saharan Africa, which are required for what they call their integrated disease surveillance and response, which every country does, to about 180 indicators, which has been built up by various donors. So social complexity at the national level is also increasing. In fact, if you look at a little country like Zambia, there are more than 100 NGOs working on malaria alone. So you can see the social complexity that's coming to bear on delivery of services, but also on surveillance. And this is our list of existing surveillance networks that we did. There's over 50 of them. And all of these disease surveillance networks exist all over the world, and very rarely do they intercommunicate. The reality of this means that if you're working in Kinshasa, for example, you may have 4 or 5 different vertical disease surveillance network working in a common laboratory, literally desk by desk by desk, with different funders, different provision of materials, and different priorities without a lot of cohesiveness. So in essence, we're dealing with a great deal of social complexity. So the question is, if we only go for the technological, we're very, very, very unlikely to succeed if we don't have an eye as well on the social complexity as another force that could destroy whatever solution you put forward. So I want to talk a little bit about what we have done. The first one, remember, was to know your corporate entity. What's your corporate identity? And this is ours. What's interesting about the foundation is that 99% of all the employees, and we are 1,000, find this mission to be completely compelling. And that's pretty unique among organizations, and it's pretty astounding. So this is our corporate identity. So bringing that into the strategic planning process in a robust way was really a key in aligning stakeholders across the foundation behind the common mission. So this is again a statement of the problem, but our focus became childhood diseases, the under fives. And as Eric has already told you, if you look just at pneumonia, diarrhea, and febrile diseases, you're hitting the majority of infectious diseases. What are you going to miss? You're probably going to miss tuberculosis and HIV in the first sense if you're looking at sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But you can add those later, and so our initial focus is going to be children under 5 with the new network that we've just put a call out for respondents who want to implement this network. Our aspiration, as I said, is to bring some of these very, very elegant molecular solutions. We are already looking at the technologies that will allow us to do that. Why is this important to us? Well, we have an organization called the Global Alliance for Vaccine Introduction, Gavi. It's a multi-billion-dollar organization which brings new vaccines into poor countries. Assists them in vaccine purchases, assists them in vaccine rollout campaigns. We have 153 of those introductions going on historically in the last 5 years as I speak. Hundreds of millions of children under 5 being vaccinated, often with routine vaccines that we all know, like polio and measles, but also with new vaccines like pneumococcal conjugate vaccine and meningitis A vaccine. And the difference with these new vaccines is that they only include some serotypes. That is to say, there are 80 serotypes or something like that in the pneumococcus. If there's a pneumococcal scholar here, they can correct me. Suffice it to say, there's only 7 to 13 in this particular vaccine. So the question is, if you roll this out and you vaccinate, 90% of your children under 5, what's coming in next? We know that this is an ever-adapting molecular and pathogenic sea of organisms, and it's very rare that you'll have an open space which isn't occupied by another organism just very quickly. And so that's what we really want to understand, is what is that evolution, not only for the foundation, but also because in a national program sense, poor countries are going to be asked to purchase these vaccines, and they need to be robustly efficacious if you're going to justify taking very, very scarce health dollars from one place to another place within those economies. So that's really an imperative. The other imperative, of course, is antimicrobial resistance, which Eric already mentioned in terms of malaria, but we're also seeing it in typhoid, we're seeing it in Shigella, we're seeing it, as was mentioned, in tuberculosis, and as was also mentioned with the NDM1, new and exciting forms of enzymes which skip from bug to bug and transmit are also creating an increasing challenge. So you can have the best empirical treatment program with peripheral village workers treating, for example, childhood pneumonia with amoxicillin, and that's not going to be effective in another 2 years unless you understand what the resistance patterns which are coming forth, especially in India, are. So these are very real practical questions, not theoretical questions that we need to have the answer to as a community, as a global community. They're very technically complex. And what you see down here on this slide on the right is just the different serotypes of pneumococcus in a molecular tree, as it were, that would allow you to, if you were a pneumococcal expert, you would take one look at that and say, aha, It's type 1. But anyway, I'm not, and neither are you, so you'll have to trust me on that. So what we're going to put together is a network of highly competent sites building on sites which are already being used in country for such activities. And we're going to integrate across the different diseases in the children under 5, including neonates, using a demographic platform that we'll also put into place. And so our first call is for 10 of these sites. We're giving out a menu of priorities based on different disease factors. Suffice it to say that this is underway. It's a grand experiment, and remember the cautions about wicked problems. We will never be forgiven if we get this wrong. No, seriously. Everything we do is going to change the ecosystem of this problem because it's a wicked problem. We have to understand that and be prepared to really observe it and iterate on it and not think, okay, here's the blueprint, we're ready to go. This is going to be a continuous iterative process with stakeholders such as country governments, populations, community groups, social organizations, NGOs. It's going to be that kind of iterative dialoguing process in order to get some success, and it still remains a great experiment. So, as I said, I think our success may hinge on social defragmentation. What I've listed here is just some of the reasons why we continue to have vertical systems. There is a commons that's created, but it's just not generalized across disease entities. And so we continue to have all of these disease-specific networks. Part of our work is to try and integrate those, tie those together, begin to get cross-communications so we can really understand the interaction between diseases in the most vulnerable population group, the under 5s. But the final common pathway for any of this information is the users. And I submit to you that the users are everybody from the communities that you are rolling out your vaccines in. They need to have a say in this, their governments, and all the way up to the international organizations as represented by David Nabarro. So thank you very much, and I think we have time for just 1 or 2 questions, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you. I think they're all hungry. Oh, there's a question.
We have some time, and there's a microphone over there. Would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Steve Aldrich with Bioeconomic Research Associates. I just wondered if you might comment on the challenge of new and the need for new vaccine production technologies, and what you might see if you looked into a crystal ball as how that landscape could change over time.
Well, I am in vaccine delivery, but I'm not a vaccinologist in any sense of the word. We're just sort of organizationally there. So I really think we've made strides in vaccine, production. What we're looking at is an increasing transition to developing country manufacturers, and that involves the whole value chain of production. In terms of new targets, that's part of the interest in surveillance, but not the sole interest. And I guess the only other thing that I've noticed as an observer is that you're going to see a lot more monoclonal antibody work going on in the space. And that's the extent. You've just reached the end of my knowledge of vaccinology.
Royston Flood, I'm the president of CMDC Spark. We're focused on self-sustaining solutions. 2 things come out of it in terms of wicked problems where we've been trying to look at them. One was the key to develop a conceptual framework, which is very similar to what you're saying, is define the solution first and then work backwards. So my question really is are you doing that in terms of creating conceptual frameworks around some of these problems? And the second question is we're very interested in the development of nanomedicines, where there seem to be some very interesting insights into these whole areas, yeah?
I'm sorry, I didn't get your second question.
The development of nanomedicines.
Nanomedicines?
Where there seem to be some very interesting insights into dealing with a lot of the pandemics, and certainly there's some evidence with superbugs. I
can't comment at all on nanomedicines. I have to be honest that since I taught at Discovery University, nanomedicines have been off my radar since I've been at the foundation, so I really haven't tracked those. The question of your first, conceptual framework, we are actually more creating what we call use cases along the pipeline to sort of test different pieces as we move forward. I think the conceptual framework that we're using will shift over time, but it'll be a product of incremental input from those use cases. So that's really our methodology.
刚才您讲到，就是目前在疾病预防过程的这个系统当中，各个地方是支零破碎的，是很难进行利用的。那么，盖茨这个公司是一个非常有名的软件开发公司，那么在这方面有很强大的能力。我很想知道，在这方面你们开展哪些工作，或者计划能做些什么东西？据我所知，在中国有很多地方已经开展了这方面的工作，虽然是这个初期的，但是有的地方是很有成效的。很希望跟你们能够形成一种合作的机会。谢谢。
Well, thank you. I think our genesis was a very strong software development company, but the foundation is distinct from that. In terms of our view and the foundation of fragmentation, I hope I've just put forward that we're trying to look at that as a piece of the problem and bring solutions to that. But as far as Microsoft, I can't answer. But thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for a most important contribution, Anne-Marie. You've brought in the social dimension of complexity. Nothing works if we don't get on with people. It all comes down to human nature and actually reaching people. And the world is full of good intentions, but good intentions are not enough. And there's a danger in technology which can estrange people rather than bring them together. So I'm beginning to understand from your presentation how important it is to bring people together. They can't collaborate unless they are in communication. I'm also mindful of that Buddhist saying that it's good to help others, but if you can't do that, at least don't harm them. And how many of our well-intentioned endeavors have untoward consequences? Benign intentions don't always lead to benign outcomes, and that's where this monitoring and surveillance seems to me to play a crucial role, if I've understood you right. And lastly, you referred to social defragmentation. I can see why you use that word, because it reminds us that there's fragmentation to start with. But another word which is perhaps more positive, to me at least, is social cohesion. And it seems to me that what you and your fellow workers are doing is bringing about social cohesion, without which nothing is going to help. So thank you very much indeed for an important presentation.